The hum of whispered conversations filled the courtroom as the afternoon sun filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden benches. Lawyers shuffled their papers, jurors shifted uneasily in their seats, and the judge tapped the edge of her gavel against the block with a quiet rhythm, as if to steady her own nerves. It had been a long trial already, and tension clung to the air like thick smoke. Then the heavy double doors creaked open. A murmur rippled across the room as a bailiff gently guided forward the smallest figure anyone had seen take the stand. She was not a seasoned witness, not an officer, not even an adult who could recount events with measured detail. She was a little girl just 3 years old, her dark curls bouncing as she walked hesitantly, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit in her arms. All eyes turned to her. The courtroom, accustomed to sharp arguments and complex testimonies, seemed to freeze in collective disbelief. A child this young? How could she possibly add clarity to a case that had already divided the town? Some observers exchanged skeptical glances, others softened, recognizing the innocence that radiated from the girl's presence. Even the usually stern judge leaned slightly forward, peering over her glasses with a rare expression of curiosity. Her name was Emma. She wore a pale yellow dress, the kind chosen by a mother determined to make her daughter look both presentable and comfortable. Her little shoes tapped softly against the polished floor as she walked, her small hand engulfed by the bailiff's steady grip. She had been told, in words she could understand, that she was here to tell the truth about the doggie. She nodded when asked if she remembered. To her, this courtroom was not a stage of law, but a room full of strangers who seemed far too serious. Her mother sat anxiously in the front row of the gallery, twisting her hands in her lap. She had been reluctant, almost refusing when the lawyers first suggested Emma testify. What if the pressure frightened her? What if she became overwhelmed and refused to speak at all? But Emma had insisted, in the stubborn way only toddlers could. I saw it, she had told her mother again and again. I can say it. And so, after much hesitation, her mother had agreed. As Emma was lifted onto the oversized wooden chair, her little legs dangled far above the floor, swinging nervously. The bailiff adjusted the microphone downward, but still it seemed too large, too imposing for a voice so small. The judge smiled faintly and said, "Good afternoon, Emma." Emma blinked at her, then whispered back, "Hi." The faint sound drew a collective exhale from the gallery. Reporters scribbled rapidly in their notepads. The defense attorney straightened his tie, preparing his gentle line of questions, while the prosecutor folded her arms, unconvinced that a child's words could carry the precision needed to sway a jury. The case had become one of the most talked about in the county. A police dog, trained and highly regarded, had been accused of attacking a man outside a local convenience store. The prosecution argued that the dog had been unleashed recklessly, injuring an innocent bystander. The defense insisted that the dog acted appropriately, that the man's own actions provoked the animal. Witnesses had offered conflicting accounts. Experts debated over training manuals, policy, and procedures. And yet, despite the flood of adult testimony, clarity remained elusive, until it was revealed that Emma had been there. Her home was only a few doors down from the convenience store. That evening, she and her mother had been returning from the park when the commotion broke out. From her stroller, Emma had seen everything: the flashing lights, the shouting voices, the moment the dog lunged, and the struggle that followed. Unlike the adults, whose perspectives were blurred by stress, anger, or personal bias, Emma's memory was marked by the simplicity of a child. She saw what she saw, and to her it was neither political nor complicated. Now, in the stillness of the courtroom, Emma swung her feet and hugged her rabbit tighter. She didn't seem to notice the weight of expectation pressing down on her tiny shoulders. To her, this was only about speaking aloud the memory that had stayed so clear in her mind. The defense attorney approached slowly, crouching slightly to avoid towering over her. His voice softened. "Emma, do you know why you're here today?" She looked at him with wide eyes and nodded. "Because of the doggy?" A ripple of nervous laughter rolled across the room, quickly hushed by the judge's gavel. But even the judge could not hide the faint smile tugging at her lips. The innocence in Emma's tone contrasted sharply with the gravity of the trial, disarming everyone who had come expecting the usual rigidity of legal proceedings. The attorney continued. "That's right. You're here to help us understand what happened with the doggy. Can you tell us what you remember?" Emma looked down at her rabbit, as if consulting it, before lifting her gaze again. Her voice was quiet but steady. The doggy was barking. He was loud. The man was yelling too. The courtroom hung on every syllable. Her testimony had only just begun, but already the jurors leaned forward, captivated. For weeks, they had listened to technical arguments and combative exchanges between experts. Now, they were hearing the same story through the unfiltered eyes of a child. And though she was only 3 years old, there was something undeniably compelling about the simplicity of her words. The prosecutor shifted in her seat, preparing to object if necessary. But for the moment, even she remained still. Emma paused, her little brow furrowing as if trying to pull the memory into focus. The silence that followed seemed endless, and then she added softly, "The man hurt the doggy first." The words echoed in the courtroom like a bell. It wasn't the full testimony, not yet. But already the atmosphere had shifted. Lawyers stiffened, jurors exchanged glances, and reporters scribbled furiously. No one had expected such a direct and startling statement from a witness so young. Emma didn't notice. She had said what she remembered, and to her, it was enough. She leaned back in her chair, letting her rabbit rest against the microphone, while the adults around her tried to make sense of what had just been spoken. For the first time in days, the trial no longer belonged to the attorneys, the experts, or even the judge. It belonged to a 3-year-old girl who had walked into the courtroom with nothing but her innocence, and with a single sentence, shifted the balance of the case. And so began the testimony that no one in that room would ever forget. The trial had not begun in silence. It began in uproar. Long before Emma was led into the courtroom, the case had already divided the town like a fault line. In coffee shops and grocery store aisles, in church basements and online forums, neighbors found themselves arguing with neighbors about what had really happened on that humid summer night outside Miller's Market. Some called it a tragedy, others a disgrace, and still others insisted it was nothing more than a misunderstanding blown wildly out of proportion. At the center of it all was a German shepherd named Rex. Rex was no ordinary dog. To the police department, he was a hero, trained, disciplined, and responsible for dozens of successful arrests. Officers praised his sharp instincts and loyalty. Children at school demonstrations reached out to pet him, marveling at the badge that dangled from his collar. To the community, Rex was almost a mascot, a symbol of safety and protection. But to one man, Daniel Brooks, Rex was the face of injustice. Daniel was 34, a warehouse worker with a rough past and a temper to match. On the night in question, he had been standing outside Miller's Market, waiting for a ride. Witnesses disagreed on what happened next. Some swore Daniel was behaving erratically, shouting at passers-by and throwing down a bottle. Others claimed he had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time when the police arrived responding to a call. What was certain was this: Rex lunged, teeth bared, and Daniel went down. By the time backup arrived, Daniel had deep gashes across his arm and leg. Blood stained the pavement, and a crowd had gathered, their cell phones capturing shaky footage. Within hours, the videos spread across social media. One clip showed Daniel screaming, his arms flailing as Rex pulled him to the ground. Another, filmed from a different angle, appeared to show Daniel swinging his foot first, as though trying to kick the animal. The town split down the middle. Those who trusted the police insisted Rex had been provoked. "He's trained to respond to threats," one local business owner said. If that man kicked him, what did people expect the dog to do? Others sided with Daniel, outraged that a police dog had been allowed to attack with such force. "It could have been anyone out there," a young mother fumed. "Next time, what if it's someone's kid?" The county prosecutor, under mounting pressure from both sides, made the rare decision to pursue charges, not against Rex, of course, but against Officer Mark Rivers, the canine handler. The charge was negligence in the deployment of a police animal. It was a move that stunned many, especially within law enforcement. To put a decorated officer on trial, in effect questioning the entire canine program, was almost unthinkable. Yet here it was, playing out in real time. From the very first day of the trial, the courthouse was surrounded by protesters. One side carried signs reading "Justice for Daniel" and "Dogs don't belong in policing." The other side held banners with Rex's face, proclaiming "Protect our heroes" and "Stand with Officer Rivers." Television vans lined the street, reporters broadcasting live updates that fed into the national debate about the role of canine units in law enforcement. Inside the courtroom, the tension was no less fierce. The prosecution painted a grim picture. They called Rex's attack unnecessary force, arguing that Officer Rivers had failed in his duty to control the animal. They showed photos of Daniel's wounds, stitches running across his arm like railroad tracks, purple bruises blooming across his skin. They played audio of Daniel's screams, filling the courtroom with echoes of that violent night. But the defense pushed back with equal force. They called in trainers and experts who testified that Rex had followed his training perfectly. He responded to aggression with control, one expert insisted. He subdued a threat without lethal force. They reminded the jury of Daniel's criminal record assault, disorderly conduct, resisting arrest. To them, this was not a case of a dog gone rogue, but of a man whose own actions triggered the response. Through it all, the jury sat in silence, absorbing every conflicting word. Emma's name was mentioned only in passing at first. Her mother had spoken quietly with investigators, telling them her daughter had witnessed the incident. At first, no one gave it much weight. A toddler's memory, many thought, would be unreliable at best. But then, when Emma repeated her version with startling consistency first to her mother, then to a social worker, and later to a child psychologist, the attorneys realized her testimony could not be ignored. "She says the man hurt the dog first," her mother explained in court, her voice trembling. "She says she saw him kick." The defense attorneys latched onto it immediately. If a 3-year-old could recall such a detail without being led, it could tip the balance in their favor. The prosecution, however, rolled their eyes. "We're really going to build a case around the words of a toddler?" One lawyer scoffed in a closed-door meeting. But by the time the judge ruled Emma's testimony admissible, the media had already pounced. Headlines across the state blared, "Toddler to take the stand in controversial police dog case. Can a 3-year-old decide the fate of an officer?" The town buzzed with anticipation. Supporters of Officer Rivers saw Emma as a symbol of truth, untainted by politics or adult agendas. Opponents called it a stunt, exploiting a child to sway the jury. Either way, the idea of such a young witness fascinated the public, ensuring the courtroom would be packed when the day finally arrived. Meanwhile, Daniel Brooks recovered at home, his arm in a sling. He gave interviews from his couch, the camera lingering on his scars as he described the attack in agonizing detail. "I thought I was going to die," he said on one broadcast, tears welling in his eyes. "That dog had no reason to come at me like that. None." His words stirred sympathy, but skeptics were quick to point out that his story shifted slightly with each retelling. By contrast, Emma's account never changed. Her mother recounted how, days after the incident, Emma tugged on her sleeve and said, "Mommy, why did the man kick the doggy?" At first, she brushed it off as a child's misunderstanding. But Emma repeated it again the next morning, and again a week later. "He kicked him first," she said. "That's why the doggy was mad." It was this simple, unwavering memory that would place a 3-year-old girl in the middle of the county's most polarizing trial in years. As the second week of hearings drew to a close, the courtroom grew more crowded. Rows filled with townspeople, reporters, activists, and curious onlookers. Some leaned forward eagerly, others crossed their arms in skepticism. But all came for the same reason: to witness the moment that could decide the case. The judge announced the schedule. Emma would testify on Monday morning. At weekend, the town buzzed like a hive. Coffee shops brimmed with speculation. "She won't even understand the questions," one man said, shaking his head. "It's ridiculous." Across the counter, another replied, "Sometimes kids see clearer than adults. Maybe she's the only one telling the truth." And when Monday morning arrived, the courthouse line stretched down the block. Inside, the air felt charged, every conversation subdued to a whisper. Court officers checked watches, journalists readied their pens, and families pressed close together on the benches. They all knew the case had already stirred the town to its core. But what no one knew not, yet, was how much power one small voice could hold when it finally spoke. For Emma's mother, the trial had turned their quiet lives upside down. Before that summer, life for the small family of 2 was ordinary, even forgettable in the eyes of their neighbors. They lived in a modest apartment on the 2nd floor of an aging brick building not far from Miller's Market. Emma's mother, Sarah, worked part-time at the local library and picked up extra shifts waitressing when she could. Their days revolved around playground visits, bedtime stories, and the gentle routines that made Emma feel safe. But the night of the incident and the decision to let Emma testify changed everything. By the time the trial reached its 2nd week, reporters were no longer just stationed outside the courthouse. They were lingering on the sidewalk outside Sarah's apartment, cameras slung over their shoulders, waiting for a glimpse of the little girl at the center of the storm. At first, Sarah tried to shield Emma from the attention. She pulled the curtains tighter, ushered her daughter quickly in and out of the building, and avoided answering questions shouted from the curb. "Do you think your daughter understands what's happening?" one reporter yelled. "Isn't she too young to be dragged into this?" asked another. Sarah kept her head down, gripping Emma's hand as they hurried past. But the spotlight grew brighter with every passing day. Friends who once waved casually in the hallways now approached with cautious curiosity. Some praised Sarah for her bravery. "You're raising such a strong girl," one neighbor whispered at the laundromat. Others questioned her decision. "She's just a baby," a fellow mother remarked at the playground. "Why would you put her through this?" Sarah wrestled with those same questions at night, long after Emma had fallen asleep. She would sit at the kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, staring at the paperwork stacked neatly by the phone court summons, witness prep notes, letters from attorneys. Each page was a reminder of how quickly her daughter's childhood had been pulled into adult conflict. And yet, deep down, Sarah knew Emma wasn't afraid. Her daughter spoke about the trial with the same simple directness that she did about her toys or her favorite cartoon. "I just tell the truth," Emma would say, hugging her stuffed rabbit. The doggy was good. To her, it was as straightforward as remembering what color the sky had been on a sunny day. She didn't see lawyers, politics, or headlines. She saw only what she believed had happened. Still, Sarah couldn't help but fear the weight placed on Emma's tiny shoulders. That fear was amplified when she agreed to a short interview, her first, and only, with a local television station. The journalist promised compassion and sensitivity, assuring Sarah that Emma would not be shown on camera. Seated on her worn living room sofa, Sarah spoke haltingly about her daughter. "She saw something that night," she explained, her hands twisting in her lap. "And she hasn't changed her story once. Not with me, not with anyone. I didn't want her to be part of this, but she insisted. She said, 'Mommy, I have to tell them.'" The clip aired that evening, and within hours, the family became the focal point of debate. Supporters praised Emma as a beacon of innocence. Critics accused Sarah of allowing her child to be exploited. Online forums boiled with commentary, some sympathetic, others cruel. Through it all, Sarah tried to shield Emma from the noise. She turned off the television when coverage of the trial came on. She steered conversations with friends back to lighter topics. She made pancakes in the mornings, read bedtime stories at night, and clung fiercely to the rituals that reminded them both of normalcy. But there was no denying the growing pressure. At the courthouse, Emma's presence became a quiet spectacle. Each day she appeared, even if only briefly, the crowd buzzed. Observers leaned forward to catch a glimpse of the girl in the yellow dress, clutching her rabbit with unwavering loyalty. Photographers angled their cameras, though court rules prevented them from capturing her face. Journalists scribbled notes, some focusing less on the legal arguments and more on the little witness who had become the trial's emotional centerpiece. Behind closed doors, attorneys debated strategy with mounting urgency. The defense leaned heavily on Emma's testimony, preparing carefully worded questions designed to keep her comfortable while drawing out her memory of the night. The prosecution, meanwhile, agonized over how to cross-examine a toddler without appearing callous. One prosecutor snapped during a late-night session, "If I press too hard, I'll look like a bully. If I don't press at all, her words stand unchallenged." The judge, too, carried her own concerns. She ordered special accommodations for Emma's testimony, shorter sessions, breaks as needed, and simplified language. But she knew the risk. "The jury will see her as pure," she told the attorneys. "You must remember that. Whatever she says will leave an impression far deeper than you expect." For Emma's family, however, the real struggle was not inside the courtroom, but outside of it. Sarah's sister, who lived 2 towns over, called almost daily, her voice tight with worry. "You should pull her out, Sarah. This isn't her fight." Their mother, Emma's grandmother, urged the opposite. "Let her speak. The truth matters, no matter who it comes from." Sarah stood caught between their voices, between the arguments of lawyers and the glare of cameras, between her instinct to protect her child and her duty to respect her daughter's determination. And yet, in moments of stillness, she marveled at Emma's composure. The little girl who once cried at the sound of thunderstorms now sat calmly when strangers asked her questions about the night in front of Miller's Market. She described the barking, the shouting, and the man's kick with the same clarity she recited her favorite nursery rhyme. When Sarah asked if she was scared to go into the courtroom again, Emma shook her head. "I'm not scared. The doggy wasn't bad, Mommy. I just want them to know." Her words carried a weight far beyond her years. By the end of the second week, the town no longer saw the trial as simply State versus Officer Rivers. It was now the story of a mother and daughter caught in the crossfire of a debate much larger than themselves. The family became symbols, whether they wanted to or not. For some, they represented honesty and courage. For others, they embodied misplaced priorities and dangerous naivete. And yet, inside their modest apartment, away from the microphones and headlines, they were still just a mother and her child. Sarah tucked Emma into bed each night, smoothing her curls back from her forehead, whispering lullabies to drown out the distant noise of the world. She kissed her daughter goodnight and promised, as mothers do, that everything would be all right. But even as she spoke the words, she knew the truth. Nothing would ever be the same again. Because once Emma spoke in that courtroom, their family was no longer ordinary. They were in the spotlight, and the world was watching. By the time Emma's testimony was scheduled to begin, the courthouse had become less like a place of law and more like a stage set for an unfolding drama. The benches creaked under the weight of townspeople who had arrived hours early to secure a seat. The press box was overflowing, reporters perched with pens poised and cameras waiting just beyond the heavy oak doors. Even the marble corridors outside buzzed with hushed speculation, as if the very walls understood that something unusual was about to happen. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with anticipation. Officer Mark Rivers, the canine handler on trial, sat rigidly at the defense table, his uniform jacket folded neatly over the back of his chair. He looked younger than his years under the harsh fluorescent light's eyes rimmed with exhaustion, jaw tight as though clenched in constant defense. Every glance he cast toward the jury seemed a silent plea. I did my job. I did what I was trained to do. Across from him, the prosecution shuffled their notes, their expressions sharp with determination. They had built their case on the claim that Rivers had acted recklessly, unleashing a trained animal in a situation that never warranted such force. But beneath their confidence lurked unease. How could they cross-examine a child without turning the jury's sympathy against them? The judge entered with her usual calm authority, robes swishing as she ascended to the bench. She struck the gavel once, the sound echoing like a command for silence. We will now hear from the witness, she announced, her voice steady but tinged with gravity. Bring her in. A stir ran through the gallery. The side door opened, and in walked the bailiff, guiding Emma by the hand. She looked impossibly small against the vastness of the room. Her curls framed her round face, and she clutched her stuffed rabbit as though it were a shield. Dressed in a pale pink sweater this time, her legs swung freely above the floor as she was lifted onto the chair at the witness stand. Every eye was on her. The jurors leaned forward, their pens stilled. The attorneys, so used to towering over grown witnesses, now lowered themselves, crouching slightly so as not to seem intimidating. Even the court stenographer, usually mechanical in her rhythm, paused for the briefest moment before her fingers resumed their steady clicking. The tension wasn't loud, it was quiet. A heavy, breathless kind of quiet, like the moment before a storm breaks. The defense attorney approached first. His tone was soft, his words simple, designed to meet Emma at her level. Hello, Emma, he said gently. Do you remember me? Emma nodded. You're the man who asked me about the doggie. The courtroom chuckled softly, a ripple quickly hushed by the judge's gavel. The attorney smiled, though his eyes flickered toward the jury. Every word, every innocent phrase, was an opportunity to sway them. Yes, he said. I asked you about what you saw. And today, I'd like you to tell these people the same thing. Can you do that? Emma nodded again, her rabbit tucked firmly under her chin. The attorney guided her through the questions carefully, mindful not to overwhelm her. Where were you that night? He asked. In my stroller, Emma replied. And what did you hear? Loud voices. The doggie barking. Her words were simple, but each syllable seemed to sink into the silence like a pebble dropped into still water. The jurors wrote nothing down. They just listened, eyes wide. And what happened next? The attorney asked, lowering his voice even further. Emma frowned, as though reaching back into her memory. Her legs swung against the chair. Then she said clearly, the man kicked the doggie. Then the doggie jumped. The words landed like thunder. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The defense attorney nodded subtly, satisfied. The prosecutor stiffened, exchanging a quick glance with her colleague. At the jury box, one woman pressed her lips together, her expression shifting ever so slightly, as if the narrative she had carried into the room was suddenly uncertain. The defense did not linger. He knew better than to push too hard. He thanked Emma softly, asked a few more questions about what she saw and heard, then stepped back. He knew the impact of her testimony was not in its detail, but in its purity. Then it was the prosecution's turn. The lead prosecutor rose slowly, her face composed, her voice carefully measured. She had spent days agonizing over this moment, rehearsing questions that would neither frighten nor confuse the child, while still challenging the weight of her testimony. She approached the stand cautiously, as though walking a tightrope. "Hello, Emma," she said gently. Emma clutched her rabbit tighter. "Hi," the prosecutor smiled faintly. "I just want to make sure I understand what you saw. You're very little, aren't you? How old are you?" Emma held up 3 fingers. This many. A ripple of amusement swept the room. The prosecutor forced her own smile, but pressed on. "And you were in your stroller that night, right? Sometimes it's hard to see from a stroller. Was it dark outside?" "Yes," Emma said. "And the dog was barking very loudly?" Emma nodded. The prosecutor leaned in slightly. "Are you sure you saw the man kick the dog? Or could it be that the dog just moved quickly, and it looked that way?" A hush fell over the room. Every juror's gaze flickered between the attorney and the tiny girl in the witness chair. Emma tilted her head, her expression puzzled, as though she couldn't quite understand why the woman was suggesting something different. She hugged her rabbit tighter and said, with quiet certainty, "No, he kicked him. I saw it." The courtroom froze. For the prosecution, it was a blow. They had hoped to cast doubt, to plant even a seed of uncertainty in the jury's mind. But Emma's words came with a conviction no expert could replicate. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't analytical. It was simply what she believed she had seen, delivered with the clarity of a child too young to lie convincingly. The prosecutor swallowed, forcing composure. She asked a few more questions, gentle ones, probing without pressing too hard, but Emma's answers never wavered. The man had kicked the dog. That was the memory etched into her mind, and no amount of suggestion could shake it loose. By the time the judge dismissed Emma, the entire courtroom seemed to exhale at once. The tension that had gripped the room melted into a wave of murmurs. As the bailiff lifted her down from the chair and led her back to her mother, the jurors watched her go with softened expressions, as though they had witnessed something far more powerful than legal testimony. Sarah scooped her daughter into her arms, pressing a kiss to her curls, whispering praise only she could hear. Emma leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, oblivious to the storm she had stirred. To her, she had simply told the truth. But to everyone else in that courtroom, the truth had just shifted. The tension that had defined the trial was no longer about expert witnesses or technical procedures. It was about whether the words of a 3-year-old child could outweigh the arguments of seasoned attorneys and the scrutiny of the public. And as Emma disappeared through the side door, one thing became clear. No matter what verdict awaited, this trial would forever be remembered not for its evidence, but for its smallest, most unlikely witness. When Emma's small voice carried across the courtroom, the entire space seemed to shrink. The wood-paneled walls, the echo of footsteps, the shuffle of papers, all of it faded into background noise. For once, there were no objections, no interruptions, no rapid-fire exchanges between lawyers. There was only a little girl in a chair too big for her, hugging a rabbit too worn to be noticed, speaking truths too simple to be ignored. Her testimony was not long, but it was unforgettable. "I was in my stroller," she said, her voice just above a whisper. The doggie barked. The man shouted. Then the man kicked the doggie. That's when the doggie jumped. The courtroom reacted, as though an invisible thread had been pulled tight. Jurors froze in their seats, pens hanging midair. The defense attorney looked almost relieved, his shoulders sagging ever so slightly, while the prosecutor's lips pressed into a thin line, her carefully rehearsed strategy unraveling before her eyes. Emma spoke with the rhythm of a child recounting a bedtime story, pausing to think, frowning as she searched her memory, and nodding firmly when she reached a detail she was certain of. She didn't fumble for words or hedge her answers with maybe. She didn't exaggerate or add unnecessary flourishes. Her story was clear, consistent, and unshakable. For the jury, who had sat through days of technical testimony about police protocols and canine training manuals, Emma's account was a revelation. It stripped away the jargon and the politics. It wasn't about whether Rex had followed departmental guidelines or whether Officer Rivers had issued the correct commands. It was about a simple question: who started the fight? And in Emma's eyes, it wasn't the dog. The defense attorney leaned in, his voice gentle but purposeful. "Emma, can you tell us what the doggy did after the man kicked him?" Emma's small hands gripped the rabbit tighter. "He barked louder. Then he jumped. And what did the man do then?" Emma's forehead wrinkled. "He fell down. The doggy was on top. The men yelled. Then the lights came. The jurors exchanged quick glances." Her description, though simple, aligned with the grainy cell phone videos shown earlier in the trial. The barking, the yelling, the scuffle, the flashing lights of approaching backup units. But her account added one detail none of the videos had clearly captured: the kick. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in her chair. She had no clear way to discredit Emma without looking ruthless. When her turn came, she approached cautiously. "Emma," she began softly, crouching down so her eyes were level with the child's, "you're very brave for talking to us today. I just want to make sure I understand. You said the man kicked the dog. Are you sure you saw that?" Emma blinked at her, her expression one of faint confusion. "Yes, I saw it." The prosecutor hesitated, then tried again. "It was dark, wasn't it? Sometimes when it's dark, it's hard to see clearly." Emma shook her head. "The lights from the store were on. I saw." The prosecutor's smile tightened. She pressed gently, knowing the jury was watching every nuance. "Is it possible, Emma, that the doggy moved first, and it just looked like the man kicked?" Emma clutched her rabbit closer, her voice quiet but firm. "No, the man kicked first." The finality of her words left no room for argument. The prosecutor thanked her and returned to her seat, her expression unreadable. But the damage was done. What had begun as the testimony of a toddler had transformed into the linchpin of the defense's case. The judge excused Emma after only a short time, mindful of her age. The bailiff helped her down from the chair, and she padded across the floor on her small shoes, her rabbit dragging slightly against the ground. Sarah reached for her, gathering her daughter into her arms with visible relief. The gallery, bound by strict rules of silence, still seemed to hum with unspoken emotion as Emma and her mother disappeared through the side door. Once the child was gone, the tension snapped. Murmurs erupted across the benches. Reporters scribbled frantically, already crafting headlines that would hit the news cycle within the hour. The judge banged her gavel repeatedly, calling for order, but even she could not erase the shift in energy. Everyone in that courtroom knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The defense attorney wasted no time capitalizing on it. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said during a break, gesturing subtly toward the empty stand, "you have just heard the words of the most honest witness in this courtroom. A child too young to scheme, too innocent to twist the truth. She told you what she saw, and what she saw changes everything." The prosecution countered with careful restraint. They reminded the jury that children could misinterpret events, that memory was fragile, that even innocence was not a guarantee of accuracy. But their arguments, though logical, paled beside the image of Emma swinging her legs in the witness chair, speaking with unwavering certainty. By the end of the day, the courtroom was buzzing. Some jurors avoided eye contact with the attorneys, their minds clearly wrestling with the impact of what they had heard. Others scribbled notes furiously, perhaps trying to reconcile Emma's testimony with the conflicting accounts from adult witnesses. But one thing was undeniable: the scales had tipped. Outside the courthouse, the media swarmed. Microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing, reporters shouting over one another. "Did you hear the girl's words? Is the trial over now that she testified? Can a 3-year-old really decide the fate of a case like this?" Protesters on both sides shouted louder than ever. Supporters of Officer Rivers held signs reading, "Trust the child," while Daniel Brooks's allies pushed back with chants of, "Children don't belong in courtrooms." The courthouse steps became a battlefield of voices, each side convinced the little girl's testimony had either revealed the truth or endangered justice. But inside, in the jury room, the effect was subtler. Emma's words lingered like an echo, impossible to ignore. Jurors replayed her testimony in their minds: the stroller, the shouting, the kick, the dog's response. Her story was not complicated, but it carried more weight than hours of expert analysis. Because while adults argued in shades of gray, Emma spoke in black and white. For her, there was no ambiguity. The man kicked first. The doggy reacted. And in that innocence, the jury found something they hadn't yet found in the weeks of testimony: clarity. The silence that lingered after Emma's testimony did not stay confined to the courtroom. By the time the bailiff escorted her out of the building, the impact of her words had begun to ripple outward like a stone tossed into still water. Inside the court, jurors whispered in hushed tones during breaks. Reporters filed urgent updates to their editors, and attorneys on both sides recalibrated strategies they had spent months preparing. Outside, the public picked up the tremor, turning it into a wave. It was no longer just a trial. It was the trial with the little girl. The defense's renewed confidence. For the defense team, Emma's words were nothing short of a gift. Up to that point, their case had been steady but precarious. They had relied heavily on technical evidence training manuals, expert testimony on canine behavior, and officer reports that justified Rex's actions. Yet all of it had felt abstract. Jurors had looked bored, sometimes even skeptical, when discussions stretched into jargon-filled explanations of canine response protocols. Now, however, the narrative was simpler and more powerful. Attorney Mark Dwyer gathered his team after court adjourned that day. "We pivot," he said firmly, tapping his finger against the table in the conference room. "Forget the manual citations and the endless debates about leash commands. From this moment forward, our case is built on Emma's testimony. She saw it. She told it. The jury believes it." His colleagues nodded. They all recognized the unspoken truth. A child's words carried an authenticity that no polished expert could match. Dwyer knew the prosecution would attempt to dismantle that authenticity, but he also knew their room to maneuver was limited. To attack Emma too aggressively risked alienating the jury. To ignore her words was impossible. The prosecution's scramble across the hall. Prosecutor Alicia Grant faced the opposite reality. Emma's testimony had landed like a punch she hadn't seen coming. She sat at her desk, papers spread out before her, replaying the child's words in her mind. "The man kicked first." That phrase had not only weakened her argument, but reframed the entire case. Up until now, the prosecution's strongest point had been portraying Rex as the aggressor. They had highlighted the severity of Daniel Brooks's injuries, emphasized the uncontrollable nature of canine force, and painted a picture of recklessness. But Emma's account cut straight through it all. Grant leaned back in her chair, pinching the bridge of her nose. "We need to shift focus," she told her team. If we can't discredit the girl, we focus on what came after. Even if Brooks kicked first, was the dog's response proportionate? Did the officer lose control? That's where we hit back. Her assistants nodded, though uneasily. They knew that jurors were no longer thinking in terms of proportionate response. They were thinking of a child, her stuffed rabbit in her arms, describing what she had seen with unwavering certainty. The jury's quiet storm inside the jury deliberation room during recess, the atmosphere was charged. No one spoke openly at first. They had been warned not to discuss the case prematurely. But their silence was full of unspoken thoughts. Emma's testimony hung in the air, unifying them in a shared experience they couldn't ignore. One juror, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, scribbled in his notebook furiously, circling the phrase "kicked first" 3 times. Another, a retired teacher, sat with her chin resting on her hand, her eyes distant but moist with emotion. They all understood what had happened. The case had shifted, and it was because of a child too young to understand the magnitude of her own words. Public reaction beyond the courthouse, the testimony ignited a storm. Within hours, video clips of Emma's quiet statements spread across social media. Though cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, artists and sketch reporters had quickly recreated the image of her tiny figure on the stand, clutching her stuffed rabbit. Headlines flooded news sites. Toddler's testimony changes course of police dog trial. Innocence on the stand. 3-year-old witness stuns court. Child's words may decide officer's fate on talk shows. Commentators debated the ethics of placing a toddler on the stand. Some praised the courage of the decision, calling it a rare moment of unfiltered truth in a system often clouded by spin. Others criticized it as emotional manipulation, arguing that a child's testimony, however genuine, should not decide such a serious case. Meanwhile, the community fractured further. Supporters of Officer Rivers rallied around Emma's words, chanting outside the courthouse with signs that read, "Justice through innocence." Opponents accused the defense of exploiting a child to sway the jury. Each side grew louder, angrier, and more convinced of its righteousness. The judges burdened Judge Evelyn Carter, presiding over the case, felt the growing weight of the situation. In chambers, she reviewed the day's transcript carefully. Emma's testimony had been brief, but its influence was undeniable. Carter knew that while the jury was the ultimate decider, her role was to ensure fairness, and fairness, in this case, was walking a razor's edge. She sighed, staring at the stack of legal documents on her desk. She had presided over countless cases, some more violent, some more tragic. Yet none had left her feeling this unsettled. A 3-year-old had become the fulcrum upon which justice teetered. Shockwaves in strategy. The next day in court, the prosecution attempted to regain control. They called additional experts to the stand: veterinarians, police trainers, even psychologists, to testify about canine unpredictability and the dangers of relying on child witnesses. But their words, though polished, paled in comparison to the simple, vivid testimony of the day before. The defense, meanwhile, kept their focus sharp. They referenced Emma's testimony at every opportunity, weaving it into cross-examinations and closing questions. Every time the jury began to drift into technicalities, Dwyer gently pulled them back. Remember what Emma told you. Remember who struck first. The contrast between the two sides grew starker with each passing hour. The case redefined by the end of the week, it was clear to everyone, jurors, lawyers, spectators, and even the judge, that the trial was no longer about abstract legal principles. It was no longer about police dog policies or departmental oversight. It was about a single moment seen through the eyes of a child, and how that moment redefined the balance between guilt and innocence. Emma's testimony had become more than evidence. It had become the story. And stories, especially those told by the purest voices, carried power that could not be undone. The final day of the trial arrived under a gray sky, heavy with clouds that seemed to mirror the mood of everyone entering the courthouse. Reporters packed the steps early, their cameras trained on the doors, while protesters once again filled the sidewalks, their chants echoing down the block. Some waved signs praising the police, others demanded accountability, and both sides knew that the outcome of the trial would either vindicate them or deepen the divide. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with nervous anticipation. Jurors filed into their seats, their faces grave. Attorneys shuffled their papers, whispering last-minute notes to colleagues. Even Judge Evelyn Carter appeared more solemn than usual, as she prepared to oversee the conclusion of a case that had gripped the entire community. This was it, the moment where weeks of testimony, exhibits, and cross-examinations would be distilled into final arguments, and ultimately, a verdict. The prosecution's last attempt, Prosecutor Alicia Grant, rose first for closing arguments. She straightened her jacket, walked to the center of the courtroom, and faced the jury with an expression of composed determination. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice calm but steady, "this case is not about whether dogs are good or bad, or whether a child meant well. This case is about responsibility. Responsibility for a man who left the scene with injuries that will affect him for the rest of his life. Responsibility for a police department that failed to ensure that its canine unit acted with restraint. Responsibility for the truth." She paused, letting her words settle before continuing. "You heard Emma's testimony. She is a bright child, and I do not doubt she spoke with sincerity. But sincerity does not mean accuracy. Even adults misremember details in moments of chaos. A dark street, flashing lights, shouts, movement, it is not unreasonable to believe she misunderstood what she saw. And even if you accept her account, ask yourselves this: does one kick justify the level of force that followed? Was the response proportionate? Was Officer Rivers truly in control of his dog? The evidence shows he was not. Grant's voice sharpened as she gestured toward the defendant. "We are not here to punish a dog. We are here to hold an officer accountable. Do not let sympathy cloud your judgment. Do not let the innocence of a child distract you from the facts. The facts are that Daniel Brooks suffered life-altering injuries because Rex was allowed to act without restraint. That is negligence. That is failure. And that deserves a verdict of guilt," she concluded with a slow nod, her eyes sweeping across the jury, searching for conviction in their expressions. The defense's final stand, when Grant sat down, the defense attorney Mark Dwyer rose with deliberate calm. He adjusted his tie, walked to the podium, and let the silence stretch for a few seconds before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice softer than expected, "I want you to take a deep breath. I want you to remember not the heated arguments of lawyers, not the charts and manuals, not the technicalities that cloud this case. I want you to remember the truth you heard from the only witness who had no reason to lie, no agenda to pursue, no stake in the outcome." He gestured toward the empty witness stand, as if Emma's small figure still sat there. "You remember her. A 3-year-old girl, holding her stuffed rabbit, telling you what she saw. She told you the man kicked first. She told you the dog reacted. She did not hesitate. She did not waver. She spoke with the clarity only innocence can bring. And that truth matters." Dwyer paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "The prosecution wants you to believe her words are unreliable. But ask yourselves, who has more reason to twist the truth? An officer fighting for his career, a man seeking compensation, or a child who simply wanted to tell what the doggy did?" She spoke without bias, without fear, without guile. "That is the truth you can trust?" His voice grew stronger. "This is not negligence. This is not failure. This is a loyal animal protecting itself when attacked, following its instincts in a moment of danger. Officer Rivers did not unleash chaos. He controlled the situation the best way he could. And if you hold him guilty today, you are not just condemning an officer, you are condemning fairness itself. He stopped, looked each juror in the eye, and finished quietly. Do what justice demands. Return a verdict of not guilty. The jury retires. When the closing arguments ended, Judge Carter gave her instructions, reminding the jurors of their solemn duty. Then they were escorted out, leaving the courtroom suspended in tense silence. Hours passed. The gallery murmured. Reporters typed. Lawyers paced. Outside, the protesters' chants rose and fell like waves, crashing against the courthouse walls. Sarah, sitting quietly with Emma in the waiting room, prayed for calm, unaware of the storm her daughter's words had stirred. Inside the jury room, the debate was spirited but focused. Some jurors echoed the prosecution's argument. Proportion mattered, and Brooks's injuries were severe. Others clung to Emma's testimony, pointing out the consistency of her account and its alignment with the videos. They weighed the complexities of law against the simplicity of truth, their voices rising and falling as the hours wore on. Finally, late in the evening, a knock on the jury room door signaled that a decision had been reached. The verdict the courtroom filled quickly as word spread. Every seat was taken, every corner crowded. The atmosphere was electric, charged with anticipation. Judge Carter called for order as the jurors filed back into their seats, their expressions solemn, unreadable. The foreperson stood, holding a folded slip of paper. Carter asked the traditional question. Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a unanimous verdict? Yes, Your Honor, we have. She handed the paper to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Carter read it silently, her face composed, then returned it to the foreperson to be read aloud. In the matter of the state versus Officer James Rivers, the foreperson began, her voice steady. We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Supporters of Officer Rivers erupted in cheers, some sobbing with relief, while others sat in stunned silence. Brooks lowered his head, his jaw tightening, while Grant's shoulders slumped with quiet defeat. Rivers himself closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, his composure breaking for just a moment before he nodded gratefully to his attorney. Judge Carter banged her gavel, calling for order, though her own face betrayed the strain of the moment. The jury has spoken, she declared. This court is adjourned. Aftermath in the courthouse chaos followed. Reporters dashed for the exits, eager to broadcast the verdict. Protesters clashed on the steps outside, their chants turning into shouts, their signs raised like shields. The defense team embraced, while Rivers shook hands with supporters, his gratitude palpable. Meanwhile, Sarah quietly slipped out a side door with Emma in her arms. The child looked around curiously, unaware of the storm she had just calmed and stirred at once. To her, the day was over. She had told the truth. That was all. But for everyone else, her words had changed everything. When the verdict of not guilty echoed through the courtroom, the case officially ended, but its story did not. What began as a routine trial about a police dog's actions had grown into a moment of national reflection, fueled by the smallest and most unlikely of voices. A 3-year-old girl with a stuffed rabbit. The effects rippled outward through the lives of those directly involved, the community that had watched every development, and even the broader conversation about justice itself. Emma's world after the trial. For Emma, life seemed to return to normal almost immediately. She still played in her backyard, asked for her favorite cartoons, and begged her mother for extra cookies before bedtime. But Sarah noticed subtle changes. Neighbors who once passed casually now stopped to wave, sometimes whispering to each other before offering polite smiles. Strangers recognized them in grocery stores, leaning down to say, "You're so brave," before Emma shyly hid behind her mother's leg. Sarah struggled with the weight of it all. She hadn't wanted her daughter in the spotlight, yet Emma's simple truth had reshaped a case, a verdict, and perhaps even the reputation of their town. Protecting her daughter from unwanted attention became her new mission, even as she knew that Emma's innocence was the very thing people admired. Officer Rivers and Rex for Officer James Rivers. The verdict brought relief but not celebration. He walked free of charges, yet the trial had carved scars he would carry forever. In press conferences, he thanked the jury, his attorney, and even Emma for her testimony, but his words were careful, measured. Behind closed doors, he admitted to colleagues that he no longer saw his work the same way. Rex, his loyal partner, remained by his side, tail wagging as though nothing had changed. But Rivers couldn't ignore how the dog had become both hero and villain in the public eye. The department reinstated him, though with new policies in place, stricter oversight for canine units, mandatory retraining sessions, and increased transparency in incident reports. Some officers resented the changes, but others quietly admitted the reforms might prevent future tragedies. Daniel Brooks's struggle on the other side of the verdict. Daniel Brooks lived with bitterness. His injuries were real, his pain undeniable, yet the jury's decision left him without closure. In interviews, he expressed disappointment, not only in the outcome, but in what he perceived as the manipulation of a child's words. "She doesn't know what she saw," he told one reporter. "She's 3 years old. And because of that, I have to live with this forever." Supporters rallied to his side, insisting that justice had failed him. Lawsuits loomed, though legal experts doubted their success given the jury's verdict. For Brooks, the trial became less about the incident itself and more about the sense of being silenced by the power of a narrative he could not counter. A community's divide, the town itself felt split down the middle. For weeks after the trial, arguments played out in coffee shops, barber chairs, and church basements. Some praised the verdict as proof that truth and innocence could prevail, no matter how small the voice. Others saw it as a dangerous precedent, worrying that emotions had outweighed evidence. Local newspapers ran editorials on both sides. The honesty of a child restored justice. When innocence becomes evidence, the risks of child testimony. Even schools picked up the conversation, with teachers using the trial as a case study in ethics, law, and the meaning of truth. Emma's name was never far from those discussions, though Sarah tried desperately to shield her from the attention. National reflection beyond the town, the case caught the nation's attention. Commentators debated the role of children in courtrooms. Lawmakers proposed stricter guidelines for child witnesses, and advocacy groups weighed in with passionate arguments. Some argued that Emma's testimony highlighted the power of honesty, untainted by politics or fear. Others cautioned that children's words, however pure, were too vulnerable to interpretation and should never hold such weight in a courtroom. Legal journals published essays dissecting the case. Was Emma's testimony truly reliable? Had the jury been swayed more by emotion than evidence? Was justice served, or was it distorted? The debate spread, refusing to settle neatly into one conclusion. The judge's reflection for Judge Evelyn Carter. The trial became the most memorable of her career. In interviews, she admitted that presiding over a case with such a young witness had forced her to examine her own beliefs about truth and fairness. "Justice is rarely simple," she told one journalist. But that little girl reminded us that sometimes clarity can come from the least expected places. Whether you agree with the verdict or not, no one can deny her courage. Her words resonated, striking a balance between admiration and caution. She understood better than most that Emma's testimony had been both a revelation and a challenge to the traditional structures of the courtroom. A story that outlived the trial. As weeks turned into months, the frenzy began to fade. Other stories took over headlines. Other controversies demanded attention. Yet the memory of Emma in the courtroom lingered. People still spoke of the trial in quiet conversations, the way the gallery had leaned forward to hear her words, the way her small voice had cut through the noise of legal jargon, the way the verdict seemed almost inevitable after she spoke. For those who had been there, it was more than a case. It was a moment of raw humanity. Emma's lasting legacy years later, when Emma grew old enough to understand, Sarah would sit her down and explain what had happened. She would tell her daughter about the trial, about the dog, about the words that had changed everything. Emma might be shocked, embarrassed, or even proud, but she would know that her voice had mattered in a way few children's ever do. For the community, for the nation, and for the people whose lives were forever altered, her testimony stood as a reminder. Truth can come from unexpected places, and sometimes the smallest voices carry the most profound weight. In the end, the trial was not remembered for the technicalities of law, nor for the heated strategies of attorneys. It was remembered for a child who sat in a chair too big for her, clutching a rabbit too worn to notice, and told the truth as she saw it. And in that truth, a courtroom, a town, and perhaps even a nation found itself changed.